Welcome to our NIAS conference keynote lecture by Amin Ghaziani called The Emplacement of Belonging. This is the second keynote lecture in a series of 3, and this is part of the larger NIAS conference on studies of belonging. For 3 days we are exploring with artists and scholars from all over the world what the notion of belonging means and how we can understand it, and also how belonging plays out in different settings, different contexts. Tonight we are really happy to have with us Professor Amin Ghaziani. But first let me say that I am Fenneke Wekker. I am Head of Academic Affairs at NIAS and I will be your host tonight. Amin Ghaziani is Professor of Sociology and Canada Research Chair in Urban Sexualities at the University of British Columbia. His research focus lies on societal attitudes and public opinions about sexuality and how this affects its cultural, political and spatial expressions. We will now move to Amin Ghaziani with his talk, The Emplacement of Belonging. Welcome.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you as we close the second day of the conference and continue our celebration of NIAS's 50th anniversary. I would like to acknowledge that I'm providing my remarks from the UBC Vancouver campus, which sits on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I am grateful to them for passing on their traditions, culture, and caretaking from one generation to the next on this site. I also acknowledge that I'm giving my talk to a community of scholars and artists located on the territories of many different Aboriginal, First Nations, and Indigenous peoples. These acknowledgements commit us to the cross-border work of remembrance and reconciliation, especially as we reflect on what it means to belong. I'm inspired by NIAS's invitation, inscribed in the conference program, to map belonging as a field of study and to sketch the landscape of belonging. Maps, landscapes, and land acknowledgements all evoke spatial thinking, and they point to the idea that belonging is intimately informed by place. Let us then spend our time together musing about the emplacement of belonging. If I may ask you to project the slide, please. Next slide, please. Imagine that you've just picked up the New York Times. As you scan the cover, your eyes, like mine, are transfixed by a single headline. Gay enclaves face prospect of being passé. I can still remember how I felt when I first read it. It was as if the sentence leapt off the front page and lunged at my heart. The year was 2007. I was a graduate student living in a small apartment in Boys Town, the gay neighborhood of Chicago. This article predicted the demise of San Francisco's iconic Castro district. This most famous gay neighborhood in North America, like others around the world, was changing. The causes were numerous: a dramatic increase in societal acceptance of homosexuality, gentrification, the ability to connect in digital ways, an influx of straight people, and casual disclosures by many queer people that they felt safe beyond the borders of this one place. These are wrenching times for San Francisco's historic gay village, the journalist wrote, with population shifts, booming development, and a waning sense of belonging that is also being felt in gay enclaves across the nation. That same year, a free daily paper in Chicago called The Red Eye published a story with another dramatic title, There Goes the Gayborhood. This is the image in the center on the slide. The people the journalists interviewed in my hometown were conflicted about this culture clash, as they called it. Some residents and activists welcome the gay migration, the journalist noted, saying it's a sign of greater equality, while others say Boys Town is losing its identity. An artistic rendering of one of the rainbow-colored pylons that adorn North Halsted Street and Market as the city's main queer artery accompanied the article, but notice that the colors are fading or perhaps even bleeding away. My friends and I felt uneasy as we read these headlines. What does it mean to call a place passé? We wondered. There was something about these urban districts that promoted a deep sense of belonging for us, and so to suggest that they were in danger incited a sense of existential threat. 10 years after the Times published the headline, which took my breath away as a graduate student, it printed another story with a title that was becoming familiar as the years went by. There Goes the Gayborhood. This is the image all the way to the right. Accompanying the piece was a photograph that shows a blurred image of a same-sex couple, arm in arm, while a woman, whom the reader is to presume is straight, is in the foreground pushing a baby carriage. The byline reads, "The West Village has undergone straightening recently." Next slide, please. I have seen haunting headlines like this around the world. The rise and fall of American gayborhoods from Vox. Goodbye to Gay London? Prospect Magazine. Identity of Canada's gayborhoods fading as cities change. Global News. And gay people moving out of their neighborhoods from the Irish Examiner. Despite the drama on this slide, I'm not here to debate with you whether or why gay districts are changing. Instead, and as we celebrate NIAS's 50th anniversary, I invite us to reflect on the significance of place for what it means to belong. First proposed by psychologists, the belongingness hypothesis posits that human beings have a fundamental and universal need to form attachments with other people. In fact, we have a pervasive drive to form lasting, positive, and significant interpersonal relationships. Psychologists concede that no person is an island, but as a sociologist, I want to explicitly broaden the scale beyond the individual. We form attachments with people as we interact with them in particular places. This changes our perspective from belonging in some vaguely defined sense to belonging in place. Hence my question, what do we learn about this idea when we look at it through the lens of place? Next slide, please. In the spirit of mapping belonging as a field of study, an invitation we received on the first page of the conference program, I will present two cases, one about neighborhoods and the other about nightlife. Both will prioritize queer populations. Our knowledge about belonging is often based in the context of globalization, nationalism, and citizenship, or else on the experiences of racial and ethnic minorities, immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and colonial subjects. The history, struggles, and perspectives of queer people are absent from this story. This I find unacceptable, as sexuality is a core aspect of the human experience. I will use gay districts to reflect on why belonging still matters in these places, despite declarations of their decline. When a major international newspaper declares that gay villages are passé, it is not remarking on a collection of streets and shops. Something else is going on here. While these places are changing, and change itself is inevitable, we must resist a narrative of decline. We need an alternative perspective about what it means to belong, one that is sensitive to doing belonging or creating belonging, not just finding belonging in passive ways. Gay districts enable queer people to feel seen, self-realized, and connected to each other as part of a community, and that sentiment is reaffirmed by the spatial embodiment of that community. After my discussion of gayborhoods, I will turn my attention next to queer club nights. This discussion will require us to confront the diasporic specter of not belonging or unbelonging. I will examine the effects of exclusion, which I see as the underbelly of belonging, a place where queer people grapple with racism and the politics of representation. Feeling like a stranger in a place where you think you should belong can bring suffering, like sitting by yourself in a school cafeteria, but I do not wish to punctuate my sentence today with pain. Where some see angst, I will invite you to see agency. Exclusion can motivate and create opportunities to reimagine what it means to belong. Next slide, please. With these opening remarks, let's begin with the observation that cities are a crucible for sexual expressions. Bangkok, Singapore, Hanoi, and Delhi are culturally and politically disparate places, distant from the gay capitals of America, Europe, or Australia, notes the historian Robert Aldrich as he takes us on a quick tour. Each nevertheless demonstrates the city as a catalyst for homosexual activity. This alliance has taken many forms. The city has shaped the homosexual from molly houses in early modern London to the culture of fairies and wolves in working class New York in the early 20th century, from the carnivalesque tradition in Rio to the multi-centered geography of Los Angeles and the cohabitation traditions in Thailand and Vietnam. In this medley are gay neighborhoods, which first formed following the Second World War. When gay men and lesbians were discharged from the military for their real or perceived homosexuality, many of them remained behind in port cities rather than returning home, potentially disgraced. Bars consolidated dense networks that made queer people more visible and inspired them to assert a right to gather in public places. Did you know, before the war, that laws in several American states prohibited queer people from congregating in public places, even in bars? Because sodomy laws were still on the books, the police could construe a gathering of queer people as a criminal conspiracy, and bars which served drinks to them could lose their liquor license. Early activists described themselves as triply condemned. They were condemned by the law as being criminals, they were condemned by religion as being sinners, and they were condemned by medicine as being mentally ill. Neighborhoods and bars became politicized in this repressive context. For the queer moral refugee of the time, these places became liberated zones and beacons of tolerance. Next slide, please. But do gay districts still promote a sense of belonging today? As an urban sociologist, I know that neighborhoods are a basic building block of cities, but we form attachments and connections on the sidewalks where we interact with others. To examine the persistence of belonging in a context of change, I interviewed 125 residents from Chicago and analyzed 617 national media reports. I discovered that neighborhoods matter for many reasons. They influence elections. They help queer people find friendship, fellowship, sex, and love. They offer safety from harassment. They nurture nonprofits and businesses. They are hotbeds of political activism, and perhaps most important for us this evening, neighborhoods are conduits of community. Let's take a closer look at this last theme, which can shed light on the active construction of belonging by queer people in a place they find meaningful. The Washington Post colorfully compared neighborhoods to the Wizard of Oz. For decades, gay neighborhoods embodied the promise of change, freedom, friendship, and acceptance. Greeting cards and t-shirts were emblazoned with the slogan, "I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore." To come out of the closet, to move to these gay utopias was to be swept up by a tornado and dropped into Oz. The black and white landscape dissolved into color. Reborn, gay people often find that old assumptions about family, love, and community fall away as well. Next slide, please. So significant is a sense of belonging that neighborhoods create that cities are beginning to mark these places. In 1997, Chicago became the first city in the world to use tax-funded dollars to create an official LGBTQ+ streetscape. The Boys Town district today has 20 rainbow-colored Art Deco pylons that resemble skyscrapers situated along North Halsted Street. The decision was controversial. A local paper published a front-page editorial that illuminates the interconnections between people, place, and belonging. Why should a neighborhood have a public sexual designation when sex is the ultimate private act? The writer asked. Tracy Baim, who manages a local queer newspaper, offered a response. The city's plan isn't about sex, it's about community. Society has forced us to define ourselves as a community to protect ourselves. Community has given gays the force to fight against hate crimes, against job discrimination and housing bias. The gay community has become family for gays whose families have thrown them out. The city's plan would recognize that community, along with the work it has done to turn the neighborhood into a place where straight people, along with gays, want to shop, eat, and live. Why does the city do it for Chinatown? Why does it do it for Greektown? Because it helps bring pride to an area of town that has traditionally been built by those communities. Her insight is worth stating in general terms. What appears as an individual and private act is in fact evocative of collective identities and communities, and thus worthy of public designation. Next slide, please. 10 years later, the mayor of Philadelphia dedicated 36 new street signs to celebrate its LGBTQ plus communities. A local paper remarked on the significance of the decision. A welcoming vibe is what organizers hope to inspire when visitors see new street signage that will designate a portion of the Center City District as the city's official gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender sensitive neighborhood. The new street signs will feature the traditional GLBT rainbow or freedom flag underneath the usual street signs. The signage is an important symbol for this city, said Tammy Sortman of the Philadelphia Gay Tourism Caucus. We can say that we have a neighborhood. Not only does this bring a sense of welcoming to the local community, it's a symbol for the world. Next slide, please. One of the things that really stood out to me as I read these media reports is a recurring reference to neighborhoods as a cultural mecca or as a homeland. For example, the year 1994 marked the 25th anniversary of the Stonewall riots, a police raid on a gay bar in New York that inspired international protests. To celebrate the anniversary, the Washington Post printed a poignant story that blended Islamic and American images. There will be a constant stream of pilgrims coming to gaze at the brick and stucco facade of the Stonewall over the next few days. Because a police raid turned into a riot there 25 years ago, because the patrons of a gay bar did not go gently into a paddy wagon, hundreds of thousands of people will descend on New York for a weekend of commemoration. The neighborhood surrounding the old saloon, a hangout turned landmark, will become an international mecca, a symbol of gay liberation. But that's what Greenwich Village has always been, a kind of Ellis Island for generations of gay men and lesbians, a crucible of gay history since before the Jazz Age. It is America's most celebrated gay enclave. What the village offered was a handful of places where gay people could reveal themselves, a cafeteria here, a bar there, a park, a bookstore, eventually a community center. But what it provided was freedom. It's a mythic place, says Joan Nestle, co-founder of the Lesbian Herstory Archives. Next slide, please. Even though Stonewall wasn't the first bar raid or even the first bar in which patrons fought back, the name Stonewall, or Christopher Street, which is the location of the bar, is used today by queer organizations around the world, as you can see on this slide. There are provocative implications here about the cross-national diffusion of queer representations of activism, commemoration, and community building. In addition, the use of religious imagery, calling a gayborhood a Mecca or Stonewall a church, for example, is ironic perhaps, but unsurprising. At the heart of any spiritual iconography is a communal affirmation. An editorial echoed this insight. Our eroticism is the closest thing we have to what in the past was called a spiritual life. In the sense, gayborhoods resemble the totems described by Emile Durkheim, a sociologist who studied religion in Australian Aboriginal communities. In both instances, there is a common motivation to seek the sacred and to represent the gods we seek as ourselves. Places thus become our church. This is why belonging often takes on a territorial, tribalistic, and at times even transcendent tone. Next slide, please. My latest research has taken me to London, where I have shifted my focus from neighborhoods to nightlife. My reflections about this second case begin with an alarming observation. From 2006 to 2016, a UCL study by Ben Kampkin and Lo Marshall found that the number of LGBTQ bars, pubs, and other nighttime venues in the capital declined by 58%, falling a number from 125 venues to 53. This slide shows you a collage of media coverage about the decline. When we compare queer and straight venues, we see that the closure rate for queer spaces at 58% compares with 44% of all nightclubs, 35% of grassroots venues, and 25% of pubs. While all nighttime spaces are suffering, the impact on queer venues is thus more pronounced. The trend we see in London is part of an international pattern. From 2007 to 2017, which is roughly the same observation period as the UCL study, the number of bars in the US declined by 28%. Thus, the impact in the capital is twice as severe. Writing for Bloomberg, Richard Morgan describes a bleak landscape. In 1976, there were 2,500 gay bars in the United States. Today, there are fewer than 1,400 worldwide. Next slide, please. Venue closures have major economic implications. The capital's workforce at night consists of 1.6 million Londoners, or 33% of all jobs. The value of London's nighttime economy is about £26.3 billion in gross value added. 40% of the estimated £66 billion for the total UK nighttime economy is represented by London alone, and the mayor expects £2 billion in additional growth of the creative industries each year through 2030. Next slide, please. In response to the decline of London's nighttime venues, Mayor Sadiq Khan appointed Amy LeMay as the UK's first ever nighttime mayor, or Night Czar. London's move follows the successful appointments of nighttime mayors in places like Amsterdam, Berlin, Paris, and Zurich, and since LeMay's appointment, the role has diffused globally. I don't want young and creative Londoners abandoning our city to head to Amsterdam, to Berlin, or to Prague, where clubs are supported and allowed to flourish, Mayor Sadiq Khan told The Independent. We can save London's iconic club scene. LeMay's task in London is to champion the city's nightlife. I interviewed her at her office in London City Hall and learned that the mayor and she drafted what they call a cultural infrastructure plan. This document focuses on the organizational embodiments of culture, the places where culture is produced and consumed, including museums and art galleries, theaters, music studios, performing arts spaces, and, of course, bars. The vision that the planning document proposes is to put culture at the heart of local regeneration, LeMay told me. The plan identifies 5 ways for how to do this. First, we need to understand where culture lives and where it thrives. Then, we should plan for and create new places for it to grow and thrive. Third, we should support culture at risk, such as declining queer spaces. Fourth, we need to increase investments in our cultural assets. And finally, we need to create policies to enable the culture and creative industries to put down deeper roots. Similar to public conversations about endangered gay districts, the mayor and the Night Czar also see a problem of decline. Gay bars are closing. Their solution is to protect the ones that remain and to encourage new ones to open. While I applaud the effort, focusing only on permanent venues overlooks the problems that existed in those places, as well as efforts to create new organizational forms. This matters for us because, as I will show you, organizational innovations can help people reimagine what belonging means and for whom, importantly. Next slide, please. I've conducted 2 years of fieldwork in London, including 111 interviews with city officials, bar owners, and the creative genius responsible for new forms of collective gathering called club nights. These conversations, like the ones about neighborhoods, also challenge dominant discourses of decline. But in the second case, we see how queer people of color redefine belonging when they encounter exclusion from other LGBTQ plus people. Muichi organizes the Cocoa Butter Club, an event which showcases queer performers of color in cabaret. The Cocoa Butter Club was born from a frustration of seeing people who blackface, she says. I was just sick and tired of it, that Black bodies aren't getting booked, but bodies that can do things which have strong connotations to Black culture are getting booked. During our interview, Muichi tells me her reaction to the closure of gay bars. I think there's a small joke when all of these places are being closed down, which is how many people of color were their clientele? How many versions of not a cis white gay man were these venues catering to? Perhaps those are the venues that are closing down, and the venues that are thriving or starting are ones which are founded by people of color. Madison organizes a queer techno fashion night called Opulence, which centers the aesthetic practices of marginalized artists. Madison echoes Muichi's intuition about why gay bars are closing and presents a sentiment I do not see in the mayor's report. Racism in the gay community, he says directly. Echoing Madison's intuition, a report from the UK found that 80% of Black gay respondents, 79% of Asian, and 75% of South Asian gay respondents experienced racial bias from within the LGBTQ plus community. Madison tells me that this pain provides the raw material for creativity. Marginalized people stride through their annihilation, turning pain and struggle into opulence, he says with a poetic elegance that gives me chills. Madison founded Opulence as a response to racism. I was tired of going to parties where I felt ostracized for being queer, parties that didn't have a lot of people of color in them, parties that had DJs that were basically white men with the occasional white woman. I wanted to do something about that. When I was in London, I discovered creativity and art thriving in the city's underground queer club scene. Sam organizes Campervan, an event in a caravan, literally, that he drives across the city and the country. He describes the event as a transportable queer performance and LGBTQ community event space that can be deployed anywhere in the world to bring performance art, film screenings, panel discussions, and workshops into the public realm. For Sam, club nights reinvent the temporality of belonging. I think that the biggest thing to come out of the wave of closures was the emergence of club nights, temporary nights, he tells me. It's very impressive to see the resilience of the queer community and its ingenuity and adaptability. While the city sees decline and embraces a reactive perspective, gay bars are dying and we need to protect them, queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or QT/BIPOC organizers, see the ascent of something new, and they embrace a generative perspective. A movement is underway of artistic individuals and collectives who are elevating London's marginalized communities by creating spatially mobile underground parties that offer a more inclusive vision of belonging. Lewis is described as an icon of London's queer clubbing scene by The Boiler Room, an online music broadcasting service. A DJ, performance artist, and activist, they married their fine arts background with a club night platform to produce a party called Inferno, which explores questions about queerness, fatness, and finding beauty in the grotesque. Like Muichi, Madison, and Sam, Lewis is also intentional about recentering nightlife. They describe Inferno as a techno rave come performance art platform that prioritizes and champions trans plus, non-binary, and queer DJs and performers. Inferno marries the camp with the underground, pop with techno, and the good with the bad, creating an exciting and unique clubbing experience. Lewis becomes animated when we talk about the closure of gay bars in London. People who say nightlife is dying are wrong, he says, dismissively and with disbelief. I would laugh in their face. When I ask why, their comedy gives way to anger. I hate these academics and these scholars that sit on panels with 3 or 4 other academics and they're like, oh yeah, nightlife is dying. Bitch, I haven't seen you in a nightclub once, Lewis exclaims. How dare you make these allegations, these sweeping statements? I flinch at Lewis's words, feeling hot under my collar as I become acutely aware of the fact that I am an academic asking about the closure of gay bars. However, as an organic intellectual, to borrow a phrase from the Italian political theorist Antonio Gramsci, my charge is to bring a queer perspective about place and belonging to the table, not to replicate these narratives about decline, demise, and closure. Muici, Sam, Madison, and Lewis amplify a counter narrative, one that resists a story about decline and whiteness. City officials, bar owners, and club night organizers agree that gay bars are closing. It's where their roads diverge that makes all the difference. The Mayor of London's 56-page cultural infrastructure plan does not have a single reference to racism, yet the organizers with whom I spoke all mentioned it. This discrepancy shines a light onto what the geographer Ray Rosenberg calls the whiteness of gay urban belonging. QT BIPOC people are often marked as other and excluded from imaginaries of belonging in neighborhoods and in gay bars through the use of racial slurs by bar owners in public or on social media, insidious practices of enforcing dress codes to enter the space, requiring multiple pieces of ID, or being denied entrance under false pretenses like the bar is at fire capacity. When racism restricts the number of places to be queer and Black or queer and brown, QT BIPOC organizers like Muici, Madison, Sam, and Lewis create spatially mobile, ephemeral, and underground club nights that foster belonging for themselves. These events are for the most marginalized groups within the queer community, Lewis tells me. They are platforming them and really giving them a voice. One final example comes from Tia, who is part of a collective of 7 queer Black artists called Babes, the pronunciation for BBZ, which itself is an acronym for Bold Brazen Zombies. They are a self-described curatorial and creative production collective with roots in nightlife and clubbing culture. Club nights like Babes cultivate a culture of authenticity, Tia says, so QT BIPOC people can be their full selves and learn how to love yourself in a racist, misogynistic, and transphobic world of exclusions. I am inspired by these efforts to recenter nightlife away from the whiteness of urban gay belonging to an intersectional queerness. Next slide, please. While I would love to let the music play for longer, allow me now to pivot and offer some programmatic statements that we can carry forward with us as we do our own artistic and scholarly work. Belonging is what brings us together at this conference. It is alluring, yet difficult to access because it is such an abstract idea. Its appeal is intuitive. NIAS organized an entire conference around it, after all, but intuition requires something more for us to establish future networks. The need to belong is a fundamental human motivation, yes, but we enact that motivation in specific places. At the end of the day, we need a place to plant our flag. This makes place more than just a container or context for something else. I encourage you to think about place as an agentic player when you sketch the landscape of belonging in your own work. With this as my baseline, I would like to propose 6 propositions for the emplacement of belonging. First, when people gather, they bring with them symbolic representations of their collective identities. These symbols connect us with our actual and imagined communities. Consider that gayborhoods exist all over the world. Zona Rosa in Mexico City, the Chueca in Madrid, the Marais in Paris, London's Soho, Schonenberg in Berlin, Oxford Street in Sydney, the Chongqing district in Shanghai. These places are culturally distinct, yet they cultivate belonging in similar ways by using shared symbols like the rainbow flag, which you would see as you walk along any of those sidewalks. The colors of the flag combine to affirm diversity, united under a single community symbol. Incorporating representations of sexuality in the built environment like this is critical. It connects people with their identities. It fosters proud associations with the place, and it thus reinforces our sense of belonging to it and to each other. Next slide, please. Second, the global and the local interact in our sense of belonging. I have visited gay districts all over the world. Each one blends shared symbols, like the rainbow flag, with matters of local significance. For example, the Admiral Duncan is a popular gay bar in London's Soho gayborhood. It is surrounded by rainbow flags. Near the entrance to the pub, however, you will see a plaque that reads, "Queer Heritage, 3 people killed, 70 injured, neo-Nazi nail bomber, 30th April 1999. This plaque commemorates a historical event that mattered to London's queer communities. Over 3 weekends between April 17th and 30th in 1999, homemade nail bombs detonated across the city. One of those was inside the Admiral Duncan. Each bomb contained 1,500 nails, and each of those nails was 4 inches thick. The explosion killed 3 people, including a pregnant woman, and injured 140 others, 4 of whom lost their limbs. This example, while difficult, shows us that belonging is multi-scalar. The global and the local interact in the attachments between people and places. Consider another example of the multi-scalar construction of belonging. Stonewall originated in the US, yet its impact was global. The Dutch historian Andrew Shield has shown that Stonewall provided a catalyst for transnational solidarity between American and European activists. In Denmark, Stonewall's influence came quickly, already in 1971, when activists formed a Christopher Street group to organize a late June solidarity demonstration. Activists planned a similar march in the Netherlands in 1977, and the first German Christopher Street Day took place in Berlin in 1979. Christopher Street Day, a name that refers to Stonewall, is used today for annual celebrations around the world, and it also inspires the names of organizations around the world, as I showed you earlier in my remarks. Next slide, please. Third, places facilitate commemorations and thus introduce temporality into our sense of belonging. London commemorates the nail bombings at the Admiral Duncan every year in its Pride Parade. The parade itself commemorates the Stonewall riots that occurred in New York. As a commemorative device, Pride parades connect the present with the past as it transpired in a particular place. For example, by being in Copenhagen for World Pride this year in 2021, I can also participate in what Linda Chatters and her colleagues call fictive kinship relations at Stonewall in New York in 1969, as I imagine a prosperous future for queer people around the world. Using cases of sexuality to think about the temporality of belonging moves us away from conventional notions of reproductive time and family time toward queer time, a provocative idea by Jack Halberstam which posits nonlinear and plural temporalities of belonging. Next slide, please. Fourth, LGBTQ+ groups are innovating organizational forms of belonging. When I was in London, I interviewed an artist named Rosie who created an installation about the closure of gay bars across the UK. I think there's something about this newer queer culture of club nights, she said. They're more about people of color. trans people of color. And I think there's a sense that there's no actual model that exists for spaces like this, and that's why they're a bit more experimental. I heard this sentiment repeatedly. Pop-ups are the model now, another organizer told me. Club nights are ephemeral, sure, but I think they have enduring effects. Spatially mobile underground club nights create more inclusive and intersectional platforms. I see them as a spatial act of resistance, a form of protest against racism. Histories of exclusion thus give birth to new forms of belonging. Next, club night organizers intentionally use the word queer rather than gay. When we speak these words out loud, we breathe life into them. We give them power, and they resonate outward beyond any one particular person or any one particular place. Naming practices are political acts. The shift from gay to queer, for example, gestures toward more visibility and more voice. This is why, in an LGBTQ plus world, bars that are merely gay can seem anachronistic. That said, there is a tension in naming practices between utility, crafting a politically legible identity, for example, and representation, or being mindful of differences. This raises hard questions for us. When we use a traditional name, what is gained and what is lost? As we rename something, what is gained and what is lost? How do we navigate these compromises? To name a place implies something about its ontology, its significance, and for whom it matters. Therefore, artistic and scholarly knowledges about belonging must attend to naming practices with great urgency and great care. In common across the principles that I am proposing for us tonight is an unstated yet undeniable kinetic energy. Imagine that you are walking along the streets of a neighborhood. As you look around, you will see the traditional rainbow flag, a symbol that San Francisco native Gilbert Baker created in 1978. Next slide, please. But you may see some new iterations as well. In June 2017, Philadelphia unveiled a redesigned flag that added black and brown stripes to represent the inclusion of people of color and LGBTQ plus communities. The inclusive pride flag, as it's called, comes in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement and in response to reports of rampant racism in gay bars. This version was later adopted by Manchester Pride, as the CEO of the festival explains, to confront racism and exclusion experienced by Black and minority ethnic LGBT plus people in LGBT plus spaces. In 2018, Daniel Quasar, who identifies as non-binary, redesigned the flag again by adding 5 arrow-shaped lines that include black, brown, and the trans colors. The inclusion of the additional stripes means placing emphasis on voices that need to be heard, Quasar said. This version, called the Progress Pride flag, evokes motion and movement in a way that I think parallels the trajectory from gay bars to queer club nights. Next slide, please. The metaphor of kinetic energy is an apt way to conclude my remarks while maintaining momentum for the third day of the conference. Belonging is not a static outcome that we achieve with finality. It doesn't end here, nor will tomorrow punctuate the lovely sentence that NIAS has begun to craft for us in this conference. Belonging is an iterative, interactional, intersectional, and emplaced process that we use to link ourselves with our local and global, actual and imagined communities. I sit here in Vancouver on one end of the computer and you on yours across the world, but we come together and we belong together under the auspices of NIAS. Thank you and happy anniversary to the magnificent Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies.
Thank you so much, Professor Ghaziani. Amin, I'm going to applaud for you. I'm sure that I will not be the only one behind my screen all by myself. This was such a wonderful, clear, hopeful talk and engaging and yeah. I'm in lots of words because you really speak from your screen, and it's very clear how engaged you are with this topic. And also, so let me first start by responding a little bit to the content of your talk. I have some questions for you, but to everyone who's at home and who wants to engage in the discussion, please feel free to pose your questions in the chat function. And we will save the full chat. So Professor Ghaziani will read all your questions and observations and remarks. But also I will be able to pose some of your questions to Professor Ghaziani. So feel free to let us know what you want Amin to answer. So as a kickoff, Amin, I kept on thinking about the documentary. I can't remember in which year, but the documentary made by Jenny Livingstone, Paris is Burning, where in her documentary she also alluded or really made very tangible this intersection that you also describe between race, gender, and sexuality. And that the one that race informs in a way ways of expression of sexuality, of gender. And in this documentary, and it made me think of the examples that you gave from these temporary places, the festivities, the scene, the community that still exists, but is perhaps not so visible anymore, and for plenty of reasons, and for good reasons as well. And I assume that you know the documentary Paris is Burning by heart, but I'm not sure, of course. But is that a good example of what you mean with this scene, this community of Afro-American gays, lesbians, or gays? I think it was trans, gays, queer, and Latinos, but there weren't hardly any or non-white queers there. How do you understand this in your frame from this queer perspective that you take?
I think that's a marvelous question. Thank you. There are many examples of this kind of radiant, vibrant, dynamic, intersectional platforms that are being produced by QT BIPOC organizers, as I referenced in the talk, queer, trans, indigenous, Black, and other people of color. Certainly, Paris is Burning is a magnificent example of this. We continue to see these kinds of images today in programs like Pose or Legendary. They are all capturing a similar ethos or spirit of celebration, of fashion, of recentering nightlife, and recentering these attempts at celebration away from dominant visual representations of those things, which often have taken the form of gay bars, mostly but not exclusively located in gay neighborhoods. These places have, as I alluded in my remarks, a radical history in terms of being illegal places of gathering that could be construed as a criminal conspiracy. And we sometimes forget that the origin of places like permanent gay bars is, in fact, radical, despite some contemporary concerns of these places as being homonormative. And they are, in fact, discriminatory in a number of ways against people of color. There are too many unfortunate examples of these kinds of practices. What I love about the example that you are raising with Paris is Burning, alongside the examples that I have provided in my lectures this evening about these queer club nights and these balls and underground events, is that they do not let racism or exclusion, these really difficult and painful practices, they do not let them destroy the incredible cultural and political vibrance of QT BIPOC individuals. When confronted with exclusion, when confronted with painful practices of racism, many of these cultural entrepreneurs are responding by creating some of the most beautiful, uplifting, spiritually transcendent places. I think it's interesting that they are ephemeral rather than permanent. And we can together, if we wish, speculate about why that is the case. Certainly, there is an economic issue that we need to confront when we are looking at some of the most marginalized individuals in queer communities, to allude to that quote by Lewis from the event Inferno that I mentioned in my talk. Then part of that marginalization includes economic marginalization. This makes it very difficult to control a permanent space, especially as we are witnessing global levels of escalating real estate values, heightened levels of gentrification that are serving as a crushing force against a number of minority communities. But again, rather than letting gentrification and these economic pressures like racism suppress the spirit of QT BIPOC individuals, what we see instead is a generative, culturally vibrant response in the form of these club nights and the ballroom scene. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. I mean, yeah. So following up on these responses, you also mentioned the word. I was struck by your example of these killings in the bar, and the place called queer heritage. That it is referred to as queer heritage. I would like to ask you to share a little bit more of your thoughts about what heritage means indeed if you are dependent on these ephemeral places, if you say we need a place to plant our flag, but the place is not self-evidently there. So how do these terms belonging, heritage, and temporality play together from this queer perspective?
That is a wonderfully complex question, and I'm grateful to hear it, and I'm grateful that those who are with us also get to hear this question and to reflect on it. It raises for us the consideration of some of the uniqueness of sexuality when we think about sexuality as the basis for collective identities and collective gatherings. Unlike many racial and ethnic minority groups, LGBTQ plus individuals have a comparatively weaker sense of our ancestry, our lineage, and our heritage. I once read this quote that has stayed with me over the years. I think I read it when I was an undergraduate student. And the quote was that I would much rather be Black in America than gay in America, because at least I wouldn't have to tell my parents that I'm Black. And it's that notion that even your family is not a place where you share demographic characteristics that are fundamental in terms of your self-understanding and the search for self-realization that creates a unique set of complications and challenges and difficulties for queer people as we try to find a place where we belong, as a place that feels like it's our own. And this is why, although notions of territoriality and tribalism are held in common across individuals, that particular experience is not specific or unique to LGBTQ plus individuals, but it can take on a transcendent tone, as I mentioned, for this very reason. given our need to have some emplaced notion of our queerness and our sexual identities. And so it's a very difficult challenge to try to understand the basis of your identity in ways that are analogous to other groups. And so this notion of creating comparisons with other major demographic groups is one that often plays out. It's inevitable. It's sometimes productive, and at other times can be quite pernicious. But this is why a number of scholars who study sexuality have described it in sexual communities as, quote, quasi-ethnic in its constitution. It's a really curious phrase, quasi-ethnic. And so it tells us the capacity in which queer people are trying to understand the cultural and multi-generational basis of their identities by drawing on these models. If you think about it, in many schools, still in many high schools, secondary schools, there are very few queer studies courses, like there are historical courses or racial or ethnic courses. Lots of universities don't offer this. There's so few LGBT studies programs, majors, departments, and universities across the world. This creates formidable challenges for LGBTQ plus individuals to learn about our own history, to know that we have one, that we come from a people, and that as a result, we also have special affinities with places, and that places are constitutional elements of how, in a multi-generational sense, we have come to understand who we are. Now, I actually thought when you first started your question by referring to the queer heritage plaque outside of the Admiral Duncan, that you were going to ask me why that says queer. And I'm wondering if that is something that you are thinking about and are curious about. If so, I would be happy to speak to it.
You mean why the word queer was well, yes, please tell me why.
Well,
I would like you to answer that question.
Well, for starters, will say that I cannot provide a definitive answer for why that is there, but it does provide for us a wonderful opportunity to think through some of these issues that I have raised in my keynote lecture this evening. Queer is a beautiful but admittedly blurry construct and notion. It does gesture toward more voice and visibility. People have used that word in a number of different ways. Politically, for instance, it has often served as an umbrella term to try to capture the extraordinary and celebratory variability of sexual identities without necessarily having to enumerate them one by one. There are some people who, so if you look at, excuse me, let me back up. So if you look at organizational names, initially they were called the gay rights groups. And then they became gay and lesbian rights groups. Yeah. Then gay, lesbian, bisexual rights groups. Then gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans rights groups. Gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, and queer rights groups. And then we started adding the plus as a way to anticipate that we cannot a priori anticipate all of the variations that it has taken us so many decades to be able to recognize in the first place. And so queer, in this case, is a pragmatist response to a recognition of the extraordinary diversity of sexualities that exist. For all human beings, not just sexual minorities, but for all of us. And so it has that connotation. It also has a decisively political one that is counter-normative or counter-mainstream, reactive, rebellious. It often also takes on inflections of an intersectional platform as well, in a way that I described. And so I don't think it makes sense, nor should we consider trying to fix the boundaries of queer, because what makes that word and its use so powerful, so significant, is in fact that it cannot be fixed or cannot be defined a priori in any one given way. It is limitlessly vast, and I think it's important for us to celebrate that vastness.
Thank you, Amin. I'm just looking into the chat, and I'm seeing that, well, first of all, many compliments from the audience. I see several questions, so let me just pick one, okay, from the audience. Aisha asks, you raised the possibility of belonging as an effect of exclusion rather than an innate human yearning. Could you comment on the significance of this shift in emphasis so that we don't remain trapped in assuming a desire to belong on the one hand, and on the other, make it possible to redefine belonging on the excluded terms?
What a lovely question. Thank you for asking it. I would encourage us to not think about belonging in a reductive or singular way. That means it is not just one thing or another thing. At its core, I would say that belonging is a fundamental and universal human motivation. It is a baseline from which flows a number of things that we do in our everyday life. I think the message that I wish to convey is that there are efforts to exclude individuals. Those efforts take many different forms. They can come from an external audience. And so when we look at the history of urban gay districts, for example, we see that they arose and came to symbolize beacons of tolerance or liberated zones. And so they were protective shields for LGBTQ plus individuals in response to efforts to exclude them from heterosexual society. As a result, they became a place where many queer people felt like they were at home, where they belonged. And by gathering in large numbers like that together, a number of extraordinary artistic expressions have come from gay neighborhoods, just like they have from collections of racial and ethnic minorities. I'm thinking about the Harlem Renaissance, for example. What I wanted to do with the example of queer club nights, the second case in my lecture this evening, was to show, in part, I suppose, that exclusion operates at many different levels. On the one hand, exclusion operates from external audiences. Straight society attempts to exclude LGBTQ citizenship. And the response to that exclusion is to form our own cultural, political, and organizational expressions. With queer club nights, I wanted to show that exclusion can also operate within a community. And so that the dynamic is not just us versus them, but also us versus them's inside, if you will, to use a phrase that was coined by the sociologist Joshua Gamson. And so that can be acutely painful because this represents the situation where you believe it is a place where you ought to belong, and yet you receive these messages that you still do not belong. For instance, being denied entrance to a gay bar despite being gay because you're a person of color. It's painful. And people have documented this pain critically with great urgency. But I think what I wanted to do, if you'll allow me to recite a line from my lecture, I do not want us to punctuate our sentences with pain. There is so much pain in the world that what I am trying to do, and what is not that difficult to do when you speak with these QT BIPOC cultural entrepreneurs in London who are organizing these underground spatially mobile events, is to see the extraordinary attention to generation and creativity and production and continued celebration, because life cannot be extinguished through exclusion. And so I encourage us to, of course, recognize attempts at exclusion, but to never deny people their agency to respond.
Thank you so much. Well, this calls for many other questions, and So picking up on the entrepreneurship, the agency, I see that here is a very interesting question. I imagine that there is a lecturer or a teacher watching this together with his students, because this is Jeff Handmaker, who asks on behalf of his students from the Institute for Social Studies in The Hague, the following question. He says these queer students of color of his have raised concerns that some companies reinforce racism in their advertising and others engage in pink washing, their problematic corporate practices, not least within the clothing industry, as well as gay unfriendly labor practices. In other words, they amplify a progressive message, while in reality they are not. Can you please speak to this, is their question.
A politically powerful question. Thank you so much to you and your students for raising it and for allowing me an opportunity to think about it and to exchange ideas with you. Queer baiting and pink washing are very real, contemporary, international concerns. They are not the same concept, though, to be clear. Pink washing often operates at the level of national governments in a way to conceal a particular country's atrocities toward other groups by elevating its performative stance, often on LGBTQ rights. Queer baiting, on the other hand, is something that many companies and corporations use, often around this time of year in June, which is Pride Month, in order, again, to present a veneer of progress so that they can reap the economic benefits. They're after your money rather than anything else. And so they present a progressive stance, but that stance is fundamentally performative in many instances because it does not change the policies of the organization. Both are troubling for similar reasons in light of our shared concern with the idea of belonging over the 3 days of this conference. Both are gestures that could make LGBTQ people feel like they belong. It is nice when you see a commercial that depicts same-sex representation, in part because queer representations have been systematically concealed and excluded from the mainstream. There's research that shows that on the ground, many LGBTQ plus individuals are hungry to see these kinds of images. But we've now recognized that the presentation of those images tends to occur in particular ways. And there are critiques that pride parades now are basically just corporate efforts and expressions trying to win economic favors, rather than, or they become distant from the solidarity and political antecedents of these demonstrations. Remember, they are designed to commemorate the Stonewall riots, which was a response and reaction against a police raid. So it's difficult because it creates a kind of, metaphorically speaking, a type of vertigo, if you will, where you think you're there and you think there's space for you either in the nation or in the mainstream. But if we examine the space that we are being offered through the platforms of queer baiting and pink washing specifically, we realize that these are not our homelands. When we think about the emplacement of belonging, we must ensure that place provides an authentic experience of belonging rather than one in which we are exploited, commodified, commercialized, and in which our humanity is fundamentally taken from us.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to hear you talk, and I'm not the only one who feels like that. So Katie Poltz in the chat says, it's such an honor to hear you speak. And she writes, I recently completed similar research on the production of queer space. comparing Amsterdam and Hong Kong. My conclusions regarding disappearing queer space in Amsterdam was quite similar. However, the racial aspects of queer space in Hong Kong was quite different. While colonial heritage certainly influences the scene and thus involves race, this operates in a very different way. How would you apply what you have found in your very excellent research regarding queer space and race to those contexts where racism operates in a very different way, such as in East and South Asia?
Terrific question. Thank you. And I'm delighted to hear that you're doing work on queer spaces in ways that leverages comparisons, international comparisons, and thus expands our knowledge about the production of queer spaces in a variety of different countries. So thank you, and please continue doing the excellent work that you are doing as well. I would respond to your question in two ways. First, I would actually encourage you, if you've not already, to watch Gloria Vecker's keynote address last night. It was incredibly provocative, and she was remarking on the production of her work and her racial identity when the national context changes, as she moves between Amsterdam and the United States, for instance. There are implications there and applications from her lecture that I think you will find quite inspiring if you've not already seen it. And I say this as a way to also create continuity across the keynote lectures in this conference, given our shared concern with mapping the field of belonging. The second thing I would say about your specific research, I like the question because it shows this is the first time we can test actually the applications of the programmatic principles that I offered for you at the end of my remarks in my lecture. And so one of those principles that I proposed, that I hope that you can take with you as over the third day of the conference, certainly, but also as we execute our own individual scholarly and artistic work, is the one that pertained to interactions between the global and the local. I proposed this principle, and I used the example of the Admiral Duncan in London as a way to express how I was thinking about it. The example that I gave is that if you go to this pub, you'll be surrounded by rainbow flags, but then you'll also see this plaque which commemorates an event of local significance to to London's queer communities. So the global and the local are interacting to create many different expressions of belonging. I think platforms that different people can access, but also platforms that have unique inflections. And so in this case, I would encourage you to think about the interaction between the global and the local in your research on queer spaces. And it becomes an empirical question for you. What elements are shared across the cultural entrepreneurs in these two countries? And what elements are unique? Those which are shared enable us to see the robustness of culture across national contexts. Those which are unique enable us to think about the irreducible contributions of nationality and national context for thinking about sexuality. All of it advances a notion of the beautiful complexity of sexuality as a fundamental site for knowledge. So carry on your excellent work.
I'm sure you will. Katie Poltz, I think that is your name. Thank you all for asking these questions, these excellent questions. So come with more of them, and I hope that I will have some more time. I see that we have about 10 minutes left. Before I move to some other questions, I still have a burning question myself to you. And that is, in your presentation, you highlight several times the headlines of newspapers or the coverage in media about the decline of gay bars, of gayborhoods, or about a kind of how did you call it, the straightening of this gayborhood. I wonder what this means to you, the fact that this is considered news by mainstream media. Why do they even bother to cover this? And why are there so many headlines that you can refer to? And what is the news item and for whom?
Wonderful question about the media, why we should care about what the media says, and what the potential value is of using the media as a source of evidence for thinking through our concerns about belonging. I think that the media produces an experiential echo on the ground, and that this is a reciprocal effect, so that as a sensibility gains traction on the ground, the media is more likely to cover it. And the things that the media covers also then distills into conversations that people are having on the ground. So in other words, journalists tap into the pulse of what's happening on the streets, and people then sometimes internalize what they read in the papers. What all of this means, really, in short, is that the media, it's a powerful source to tap into a cultural zeitgeist, either within a country or especially when you can identify patterns in headlines across the world, as I've tried to do earlier in my remarks, then international trends in the cultural zeitgeist. Personally, in my work, I use the media to make inferences about trends that are transpiring across a country. Major presses like the New York Times or the Guardian at once reflect, and they also arbitrate public expressions of sexuality, especially those viewpoints that reflect sensibilities for which there is at least some amount of agreement, or sensibilities for which there is a considerable amount of debate. That's also quite important. I don't think that there is a superior source that can produce a national, let alone qualitative, portrait of contemporary life in gayborhoods across any country, be it the US or Canada, Amsterdam, anywhere. For instance, as you know, I'm interested in what things mean to people, how they make sense of their surroundings, how they think about belonging in their life. To understand questions like that, we have to talk to people. We need to interview people. Can you imagine trying to collect 600 or more interviews from major gay districts across a country? I mean, that is a very, very difficult and exceedingly expensive task. It's hard enough to do it in just one city with the 125 interviews I collected in Chicago. And so for me, I basically used these newspapers as a way to take advantage of the interviews that multiple generations of journalists have conducted across the United States, because the 617 media reports span like 27 different urban, suburban, and rural contexts and 40 years of coverage. So if we use that not to make statistical generalizations, but instead to hear people's voices, then it's actually extraordinary. And for those who think they might like to do something like this, I would offer some advice about how you can do that. So personally, at first, I read all of the articles in order to clarify persistent claims about decline or demise. That seemed to be a major theme that was emerging, just from the headlines at least. But just as every coin has two sides, so too did I reread every article against its own grain, if you will, to push past those dramatic headlines in search of more nuanced themes. So you'll notice, for instance, when I presented that table of the reasons why gayborhoods matter, and community building was one. I mean, that finding is absolutely working in the opposite direction of a headline that says gay districts are becoming passé. So if we reject the sensationalist headlines, although still think about them as a cultural indicator, I think this type of data enables us to tap into sensibilities across the country, to access interview transcripts that would be nearly impossible and formidably expensive for us to collect individually, while still being able to bring nuance to the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for your response. And then my final burning question, and then I will move and give the floor to the audience, and I will give you the final words. One image sticks to my mind of your presentation, and that is the image that you saw in the newspaper of this same-sex couple, and then in the front, the woman with the assumedly heterosexual woman with the child, the buggy. I don't know I forgot the English word. And then you said you quoted someone who said, "What would happen if we moved from reproductive and family time to queer time?" And it made me start thinking, what happens if these three type of times are combined with all these many queer couples who have children, who have family time, who don't have time perhaps to enjoy the queer nightlife or the underground. So so assumedly a heterosexual woman with a baby, but perhaps not. And how does queer time comply with reproductive and family time? Is that a possibility for you?
It's a deep question. Thank you. Not a gentle final question, but I love it. It's an incredibly inspiring question. I think if we initially imagine reproductive time, family time, and queer time as ideal types of things, then it's incredibly useful, because what it is doing is that it is introducing complexity into how we think through the temporalities of belonging, in that there are many different temporal modes or frameworks, different ways of thinking about time, and how it is related to belonging. So in that respect, as ideal types, each of these three, and it's not an exhaustive list, there are other ways, other concepts of time can be quite productive and valuable for our work. Now, to be clear, queer time does not mean the ability to go out to a bar or spend time in nightlife. So it's not about how you use your time, but instead what time itself means. I love the question about whether queer time applies in the context of a queer family with children. So that is queer time antithetical to reproductive time? And here you raise an example in which the two are potentially fusing or overlapping, at least in some sense. But I think even here, LGBTQ plus families are innovating the meaning of kinship and family, and thus time, in the practices that they cultivate, not just in their households, but with their extended networks as well. So the notion that the village that is raising the child, or the incorporation of friends and friendship groups as part of your family, creates an understanding about how time unfolds and with whom time is connected, its lineage, in ways that are not necessarily, or at least exclusively, linear, in that it's recursive, or to say that differently, it goes back and forth and moves in and out of different imaginations about what time is and how you move through that time. Most importantly, the fact that it is heterogeneous. It is plural, and that we don't move in just one direction through our lives, with people, through our developmental stages, but that there are always opportunities for us to go in and out of moments that we have experienced before and can experience again, and continue to do so in the future.
Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you so much for this response. And then finally, there was a question posed by Philip Kasanich. And he wondered, what can you say about the influence of COVID-19 on these nightlife venues and the communities that you are working with and describing?
Well, it's a wonderful contemporary question. COVID-19, a global pandemic, has undeniably had an effect on the viability of all kinds of commercial, nonprofit, and community spaces. So many different businesses and venues have closed. We've not been able to go to a bar or a nightclub for a long time in light of physical distancing protocols, and many places they were just closed down. Yeah. And so and we see the effects of that. A number of gay bars in cities across the world have shuttered as a result of the pandemic. Hopefully some will experience a renaissance. Collectively, I think certainly we will see a renaissance, but it's the case that some may not reopen. As these physical distancing and public health protocols began to slowly and carefully loosen, we did see a number of strategies adopted by gay bar owners in gay neighborhoods that, to me, represented an effort at resilience. So again, resilience is the place where I would encourage all of us to look, rather than the destructive effects of the pandemic, without naively denying the very real material effects of the pandemic. So I remember one particular bar in Vancouver early in the pandemic, when we were allowed to gather in physically distanced way in a limited capacity in bars. They ended up putting up these acrylic or plastic shields between tables so that people could continue to gather. It's now a very common practice at restaurants and bars across the world. But during the early days, when we first saw that, I actually found it incredibly inspiring. It represented for me that the spirit of gathering together, the collective or communal spirit, will not be extinguished by this virus. And that bar is still around and doing incredibly well. You know, some of these underground club nights they've not been able to produce events, which raises a question about, well, what's going to happen to them? And I think the realistic answer is that some of those parties may not continue. But again, that is not where I wish for us to punctuate our sentences. What I wish for us instead to think about is that the pandemic perhaps has reconfigured how organizers and cultural entrepreneurs and artistic collectives are thinking about these gatherings. Let's think about them as operating in an abeyance structure. For something to be in abeyance means that it sits awaiting the possibility to reemerge again in the future. Not that it is extinguished, not that it has seen its demise. It is an abeyance. And so similarly, when the world starts to open back up, and it will, it already is, we will see a dramatic, dynamic, and I imagine even reconfigured reemergence of these scenes in ways that will be even more incredible than they already were.
This is a very hopeful and great way, I think, to end this keynote, because indeed we've seen so many hard times, destruction, exclusion, and deaths with the pandemic, but also with other structures that we are embedded in, as you have shown also. And it indeed to make the connection to to the 2 other keynote lectures. So yesterday, Professor Gloria Wecker ended with emphasizing that she does not want the audience to see her as a victim, because she was actually she conveyed how happy she is that through these mechanisms and structures of exclusion and discrimination, she has gained so much strength, experiences, that she has learned so much about the world, that she has a perspective like you use this queer perspectives, and this brings you such wonderful, innovative, and brilliant insights and wisdom to share with us. So, the connection with tomorrow is that you mentioned that you said for marginalized groups or threatened groups, minority groups, these are not our homelands. That is something you said. Tomorrow we will have the keynote lecture by Nadim Rouhana, which is called Homeland. And this focuses on the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. But I think that many of the mechanisms of the problems that you have pointed at in your talk can also be felt in this conflict and in the talk that Nadim Rouhana will have tomorrow. So I will thank you for having this bridging talk tonight. And I want to end with a remark by Elisabeth Kiendorfer, one of the audience members. She says, "Thank you very much for this great tour across the connection of queer articulations, difference, place, and community." I think we all learned a lot. Thank you so much, Professor Amin Ghaziani. Thank you.